Let me take you back to 1989. A woman walks in for a meeting that will decide her future. She's a single mom who, after her husband left her, worked full-time and went back to school full-time to make a better life for her and her daughter. Across from her sits the tenure committee at the college she works at. None of them look like her. She's up for consideration for tenure, which for her would mean lifetime job security for working her dream job, which was running a center for students with disabilities. It's the actual very center that 20 years earlier she entered into as a student when she was restarting her academic career. She's a little person, so this is particularly personal to her. The chair of the committee leans back in his chair and says, "Thank you, but we have decided to deny you tenure. Because, well, you can't reach more than the bottom 6 inches of a chalkboard. And what kind of teacher would you be if you can't use the top technology in our classroom, meaning a chalkboard? Thank you and goodbye." That woman was my mother, Joan Hare. A year later, the Americans with Disabilities Act passes, and that very action would have been illegal because people fought for it. The ADA passed because people died fighting for it. Died of disabilities that, when combined with structural barriers, kept them from leaving their homes. Died from having been sent to institutions and nursing homes as children, and growing up where the smell of oxygen was always tainted with the smell of death. I walk in the room and you can tell I'm a person with a disability. In my case, dwarfism. I'm one of the 20% of people with dwarfism who grew up in a family where my parents also had it, as do 2 of my 3 kids. This isn't the case for most families that include people with disabilities. Most of us grew up in households with no one like us. And when I say us, I mean the roughly 1 in 5 Americans that have a disability in this country. 1 in 5. So that's 20% of your graduating class. That's 20% of your coworkers. It's 20% of your family, 20% of your friend group. We are here in society today because our elders worked on legislation like the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, where people like them, those of us sitting in this very room today, could experience full participation, equality of opportunity, economic self-sufficiency, to be able to live independently. In other words, the American dream, if you will. Because before the ADA, disabled people couldn't leave their homes to go to the grocery store, to go to the bank, to go to a happy hour. Before the ADA, you didn't see sign language interpreters here on this stage, at concerts or at comedy shows. Before the ADA, the community didn't have access to society. Parents were pressured to give up their children at the point of birth so that they would be warehoused in massive institutions, never seen, never held, never played with by their families. To be disabled meant you could literally be arrested off the street under ugly laws until as late as the 1970s. But let's go back to that pivotal day, July 26, 1990. It was hot, sticky, and damp. One of those days that remind you that our founding fathers had the genius, if you will, to build the nation's capital on a swamp. Back when the ADA was being actively fought for, the image of disability was one of white men in wheelchairs. For most people, the concept of disability and accessibility itself meant curb cuts and braille, not sign language interpreters when the governor's on TV talking about an incoming hurricane, or the speech-to-text functions I know that all of you use on a regular basis and never think about the fact that it wouldn't exist if it weren't for disabled people. The world has changed, but the need to provide access to ensure opportunity has not. They gathered on that south lawn of the White House, the lobbyists who literally did the wheeling and dealing, pun intended, alongside the activists who had thrown themselves out of their wheelchairs and dragged themselves up the steps of the United States Capitol to protest the lack of equal treatment under the law. People with intellectual disabilities who had only recently been released after spending the first half of their lives in an institution. The deaf community who had fought and rebelled to have Gallaudet University for the first time led by a deaf president. The ADA, as a law, affected over 1/5 of our population. It was the largest expansion of civil rights since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the diversity of the lawn on that day clearly showed it. And it was signed under a Republican administration. So why did George H.W. Bush not only sign the bill into law, but he made it a part of his campaign pledge? This was historic. It's because President Bush knew a secret. The ADA was more than a law. The ADA was freedom. In his case, it was freedom for his 3-year-old daughter, who who had passed away after battling leukemia. But had she lived, he knew that she would have been fighting her entire life for access to society. He saw his daughter when he got a Dear Mr. President letter from Lisa Carl, a girl from Washington State, who wrote him a letter about wanting to go to the movies with her friends. That's all she wanted, to go to the movies, and she couldn't. It's your cousin with a learning disability, your mom who's a cancer survivor, your best friend who started therapy in college when they started dealing with anxiety, and your neighbor who served in the military and stepped on an IED. Lisa's story, that of the girl that wanted to go to the movies with her friends, helped cause a cultural shift in how we think about disability that has repercussions even today. For those of us who grew up with the ADA, its impact is both subtle and powerful. You may not even think about it. We're on the tail end of what we like to call the ADA generation, the first generation of Americans who have grown up with the connection between the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. People at this intersection have what we like to say the benefit of the connection between preparation, access, and opportunity. Not only have you always gone to school with your disabled peers, which is the preparation piece, but those same peers have the right to be able to access and move about society just like you can. This is the access part. And with the addition of access, it should open the door to opportunity, ensured by the non-discrimination protections in place when you move into work. The idea is if you've done the work, you should be able to access the spaces and be provided the opportunity to succeed. Back in 1990, when the ADA was passed, only 2% of people with disabilities went to college. Today, roughly 11% do. That is because for one of the first times in history, policies are somewhat working together. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which governs your rights from K through 12 public education, means that when you're 16, you get to be asked what you want to be when you grow up. 16. That might not sound like a big deal, but for young people with disabilities, this very question, this process of what they call transition planning, was revolutionary. But can't we all take a moment to agree that waiting to ask somebody what they want to be till they're 16 years old is a bit late? Children are drawing pictures in preschool about wanting to be scientists. We have Take Your Child to Work days and job shadowing, but for people with disabilities, we're still fighting the basic expectation that we can't achieve, that we can't succeed, and that we're unable to contribute. What good is it to graduate if you can't enter the place you want to work? Imagine if you grew up wanting to go work for like Facebook or Twitter, and you show up for your interview with your degree in hand, and you literally cannot walk in the door. Or you walk in and you literally cannot understand a word coming out of their mouth because you don't have a sign language interpreter. Preparation falls short without access. The ADA takes that expectation and runs with it. It says not only do we believe that you can achieve, we know that you still need access to do so. It has said this for almost 29 years now, and we've seen disabled people achieving great things in that time that would have seemed impossible before. But there still are so many people facing ableism, autism, and structural barriers. Ableism being the oppression and discrimination faced by disabled people, and autism being the oppression and discrimination faced by the deaf community. So what does disability mean in the 21st century? Reflecting back on preparation, access, and opportunity. It looks different. It's taken it from the shadows and pushed it into the mainstream in new and exciting ways. Innovation and technology means new access to spaces in new and innovative ways, via telecommuting and video conferencing. But at the same time, technology should never be used as a Band-Aid for an organization or a company deciding that they don't want to be accessible. You grew up watching Dick Clark on television on New Year's Eve. That in itself is revolutionary. That was his show. That was his night. After his stroke, if you looked on the internet, people continue to talk about how he should just retire from the spotlight. He should stop working. No one wants to see that on television. To me, it symbolized the opportunity to see something that made others uncomfortable. It was power. But Dick Clark did the preparation. The access was a given. No one would have told him that he didn't have a right to be King of New Year's. He'd always been King of New Year's. Did he have to change up how he ran the show in a way that would work for him given his disability? Yeah, he did. And it provided an opportunity to see disability front and center on one of the busiest nights of the year, contributing to American culture and exercising tangible media power and presence in a way like never before. Senator Tammy Duckworth, a military veteran, a stateswoman, and for me, a mom, snuck her iPhone in a prosthetic leg to film a sit-in on the floor of the House of Representatives, fights for the rights of the constituents of Illinois, and daily fights to protect the Americans with Disabilities Act from the numerous attacks it's facing. Kendrick Lamar, recent Pulitzer Prize-winning hip-hop artist who has talked about and lived with depression and trauma in his art and in his work every day. Trauma and discussions around trauma and its connection with racism, sexism, ableism, and homophobia really are the next directions that the disability community needs to be thinking about. The last example I will give, well, I'm a little person, I have to talk about him, is Tyrion Lannister. The most badass character to grace the television screen in at least 10 years. So beloved and adored that all of you, the average height public, will even dress up as him for Halloween. You wear shirts with a little person on them. You share memes that never mock his height, but always celebrate his intellect. Last year, I opened the front door on Halloween, and there in front of me stood a 6'2" teenager dressed as Tyrion Lannister. Mind you, I didn't know what to think. Even more so, I don't think he knew what to think when I was standing on the other side of the door. But think about how important that is culturally. We have a non-disabled person wanting to be a disabled person. He could have been Jaime, he could have been Jon Snow, he could have been the Hound, but no, he chose Tyrion. Those are just a few examples, but whereas back on that day in July in 1990, the public saw disability and thought men in wheelchairs, the community looks much different today. So what does the community look like? 37 million people who deal with migraines on a regular basis. 30 million people with eating disorders. 1 million people who live with chronic fatigue. 15 million women with endometriosis. 25 million with IBS. 43 million people who live every day with a mental health disability. All of you have the same protections that were won by that same generation who chained themselves to buses and crawled up the steps of the Capitol. The progress of the ADA is demonstrated not only by the fact of all of those examples, but that the daughter of the woman denied tenure for only reaching the bottom 6 inches of the chalkboard, 21 years later walked into the White House where she served as the director of diversity outreach for President Barack Obama. And she wasn't the only one. There were 5 disabled women who served in the White House in the Obama administration, a building decades ahead of the curve on accessibility because of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who also understood the connection between preparation, access, and opportunity, the cornerstones of the American dream. But today there's repeated threats to roll it back. Today the ADA is under attack. There are people who say that providing access to people like me, it's too expensive, but there are tax credits to help. There are people who claim that disabled people file too many lawsuits to get rich and access to too many places. The law has been the law for 28 years. You've had 28 years to become accessible. And disabled plaintiffs are not able to collect monetary damages if we win a lawsuit. All we can win is access. That we don't need to go to shopping malls or hotels. But why should your money be looked at any differently than my money? Haven't I labored to earn it? They say we should be happy going back to the way things were 29 years ago because, hello, ableism's been eradicated. Didn't you get the memo? Telling people you have rights automatically lifts you out of the last almost 40 years of poverty, oppression, and institutionalization. Non-disabled people think that the world has changed so much, that the ADA is great, you say. People have access. You say things like, the only disability is a bad attitude. Frankly, there are few phrases that I find more insulting. When you claim that disability doesn't exist or isn't real or you don't see it, it completely diminishes the threats that I face when I walk down the street and have people come up to me and tell me that they can literally pick me up and walk off with me, leaving my children abandoned because they think it's funny to mock disabled people. It diminishes the fights to get laws like the ADA passed and the oppression that still exists. Over 70% of polling places are still inaccessible. Women with disabilities make 73 cents on the dollar compared to men without disabilities. Our unemployment rate hovers around 70%. Our young people are 3 times more likely to end up in foster care, 6 times more likely to end up in jail. The work of the ADA is not done while 50% of the individuals killed by law enforcement are disabled people. And in 32 states, if you're a parent with a disability, the state can come in and take your children with no more cause than solely the fact that you have some type of disability. Because of this myth that equality and inclusion have arrived for the disabled public, people think about disability rights not as rights, but as special privileges. Non-disabled people hire disabled people to get through the lines quicker at amusement parks. Who gets punished for that? Disabled people. Non-disabled people print off fake documentation to give Fifi a vest and get her on the plane. Who gets punished for that? Disabled people. Non-disabled people steal a dead relative's parking placard to not have to pay a meter. Who gets punished for that? Disabled people. When in reality, if you had to live our lives, if you had to deal with the oppression fatigue that we live with, the pseudo-voyeurism, spending weeks navigating bureaucracies to get to the one damn person who can approve something like a piece of software to allow you to read, or a key to a restroom, you'd be as fired up and as frustrated as we are. The latest attack on the community in the ADA is part of a much broader strategy to get those of us that are deemed unfit out of the public eye, whether it be the Muslim ban, HB2, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, or attacks on the ADA. All of us from marginalized communities are seeing that even with the work done to prepare and the promise of opportunity, denial of access can still pull the rug out from under us. Instead of the world we live in getting bigger and bigger as access improves, we're seeing it shrink. We talk about always wanting better futures for our children, futures where they can be more prosperous, face less discrimination, less inequality, future of less steps and more ramps. The power of the community is in its diversity, its evolution over time. From kids with polio in the 30s to autistic outfielders in 2018, we continue to fight for a seat at the table while you continue to put our rights on your menu. But we must speak out. We must use our voices to remind people of the importance of the fact that we are here to move from preparation to opportunity and that access is still important and sadly lacking. Preserving disability rights and the legacy of the ADA is the work of your generation to continue. Your voices are central to the fight ahead. While there are folks working to turn back progress, you can be a voice promoting inclusion. You can bend the arc of justice into a ramp. So I guess what I'm saying is, what I'm doing is inviting not just the 1 in 5 of you who is out as one of us, but the additional 4 out of 5 of you to join us and preserve these rights. Because the world is a more just place when your sister, your friend, your neighbor, and your mom are at the table. So it's on you to help ensure that their rights continue to be protected. I welcome you to the fight.